Myanmar's ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi is back in court today facing a new trial for alleged corruption. The pro-democracy leader has faced a long list of charges since her government was overthrown by a military coup in February. The junta has ramped up violence to try and crush a popular uprising. The UN is warning that the window of opportunity to stop the army from entrenching its rule is growing smaller by the day.
The people protest, the military cracks down. It's a cycle that's been repeated many times in Myanmar's history. Most recently, earlier this year, the military deposed the country's fledgling democratic government in February and arrested its leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi. Since then, she's been under house arrest, facing a wide array of charges, including incitement, the deliberate spreading of misinformation to agitate the people, violating COVID-19 restrictions, and illegally importing walkie-talkies to be used by her supporters. If found guilty, the 76-year-old could face decades in prison. Meanwhile, the human rights situation in Myanmar has deteriorated rapidly since the coup.
Over 1,100 individuals have reportedly now died at the hands of the security forces since the coup. Over 8,000 individuals, including children, have been arrested since the coup, with over 4,700 remaining in detention. Most are held without any form of due process and lack access to legal counsel, or even the ability to communicate with their families.
The military government faces increasing international isolation and a cratering economy that's seen widespread shortages, with a humanitarian crisis looming. The UN has called for Suu Kyi's immediate release as a first step towards restoring order. Yet her trial is set to go ahead, as resistance in the streets continues, despite the government's harshest efforts to suppress it.
For more now, I'm joined by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Amin Tan, who's currently based in Bangkok. Good to see you again. First of all, those charges against Aung San Suu Kyi, her supporters say they're trumped up, that the case is politically motivated. How do you see it?
So what we're seeing from the junta now is the persecution of top political leadership in Myanmar under a host of charges. The most recent spate of charges has been for corruption. We've seen various ministers and local government leaders charged with corruption with very little evidence to show how they could have committed these crimes or that these crimes indeed took place. I think in the case of Aung San Suu Kyi, we also need to look at some of the other things that she's been charged with, one of which is incitement of public unrest, with the junta citing the public's response to the coup as evidence of her crime. And yet with her, we see that she was arrested on the very first day of the coup in the pre-dawn hours. And so it's very difficult to see how she could have committed at least this crime, which obviously brings into question the legitimacy of many of these other charges that she is being held without very little access to her lawyers and in an unknown location for.
Following the full military takeover, there were massive protests that were violently crushed. What has become of that protest movement?
Yeah, so in the first few weeks of the protests, we saw hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people in the streets. And we saw that, people really faced the high risk of death for conducting those protests. So what we're seeing now is a nationwide protests are still ongoing. However, they take the form of these small flash strikes that are happening in various cities and towns across the country. They're largely organized to be less than 10 or 20 minutes, and they are sort of very ad hoc and involve very few people in order for people to be able to continue to show the world that they do not consent to this form of government and yet are trying to stay safe. We are also seeing a continuation of the civil disobedience movement, which has seen over 100,000 civil servants who are continuing to strike and continuing to refuse to work for the junta, many of whom are now in hiding as the junta has been trying to sort of hunt down these striking workers. People are continuing to boycott military-owned and affiliated companies. And we've also seen a civil government that has risen up and declared themselves to be the legitimate government of Myanmar. but we are definitely seeing a decrease in in-street protest as these forms of resistance become more and more dangerous.
Now, the UN Secretary General this week gave a stark warning about the Myanmar crisis. He said there's a risk of large-scale armed conflict and what he called a multi-dimensional catastrophe. Do you have any idea what he's referring to there?
Yeah, so Myanmar is technically at war. At the moment, the civilian government I was just talking about, the National Unity Government, has declared what they're calling a people's defensive war, calling on the people of the country to fight against the military. So what we're seeing now is more and more armed clashes taking place between local non-military militias against the military. We're seeing a number of targeted assassinations as well as the use of bombs and landmines. And really, we're seeing a stalemate in which the military is unable to fully repress the people and the armed insurrection that is taking place across the country right now. And these local militias are largely unable and do not have the firepower to actually defeat the military. And, on top of the fact that there is now essentially a war that's taking place across the country, Myanmar was already a fairly poor country to begin with weak healthcare infrastructure as well as education infrastructure. And there's a real risk that millions of people could fall into food insecurity in the coming months. And economists are predicting a double-digit contraction in the economy in the next year.
Journalist Amin Tan there in Bangkok. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.